I thought we'd start off with the title because, as you might know from your agenda, the title actually said Startup Wisdom, Do's and Don'ts. And you notice this doesn't say that. And that follows the principle of every great entrepreneur is ignore everything your VC says. But I'll tell you why, is that, well, I love the note, Startup Wisdom, Do's and Don'ts sounds like I'm smarter than you. And therefore, there's some reason to pay attention because this is an IQ problem. It's not. The reason I'm up here is I've managed to screw it up more times than probably most of you combined. And so what you're going to get is a set of heuristics and lessons, maybe in bullet points, about the things I've learned as 21 years as an entrepreneur in 8 startups, and now a decade or two, because I no longer do, I teach, about watching a ton of entrepreneurs as both students, as an advisor. So I'm going to kind of structure this talk of what I wish I knew. But the first thing you all already know is kind of this, and it was amazing it was said by somebody 100 years ago. This is a quote from someone named Daniel Burnham. Said, "Make no little plans. They have no magic to stir men's blood, and probably themselves will not be realized. Make big plans. Aim high and hope and work." That's what all of you are doing, every one of you. You're making big plans. You're aiming high. And that kind of brings us to the first lesson for me, which was an expensive one, which was big ideas take as much time as small ideas. And I don't mean only in your company, but about the time you spend as CEO. I remember chasing $1 million opportunities when there were $50 million opportunities in front of me. I remember letting my head of engineering or products convince me that X feature was important when in fact there were bigger opportunities here. I remember my VCs telling me to go after X when I kind of knew my vision was still Y, and losing sight of that. I don't have to remind you, you all got funded, particularly from Vinod, about big ideas. But losing sight of that is just a very expensive lesson, because the thing you don't get back is your time. It takes as much time and as much energy to chase a big one as a small one. The other one, just for culture, that was the warm-up. Here's the one that's smack on the head. When I retired, I realized there was a pattern in my behavior and others I had seen, and I started asking my students one question. And I'll ask you this, but you don't have to raise your hand. And the question was, for those of you who want to become CEOs, how many of you come from dysfunctional families? And there's somebody already voting. That's a symptom. But founders from dysfunctional families turn out to be a disproportionate number of the CEOs in Silicon Valley. Look, good number of you are nodding. Let me explain. If you're a survivor of a dysfunctional family, the one thing you've learned how to do is bring order out of chaos. And 2 is, when everybody else is seeing chaos, you're going, really? Throwing plates at each other? Normal day. Exec staff screaming at each other? Great. Just, no one got killed today? Great. For those of you who aren't from dysfunctional families, you might be working for someone who's come from one, and you could recognize this by when finally you find a repeatable business model. These CEOs throw hand grenades into their own company to keep chaos going. Anybody ever work for those people? Right? It turns out you should just recognize this pattern, and for those of you who come from this background, it's actually an advantage for the first time in your life. But just understand the consequence of what happens when your company begins to scale, and in fact, a repeatable day-to-day activity needs to happen. And by the way, when I had this insight, I went to a VC who had been my mentor for about 25 years, a woman named Catherine Gould at Foundation Capital. I knew her actually when she was a recruiter, and her background was actually great people skills. I said, Catherine, did you ever notice this pattern about some CEOs in Silicon Valley? And she looked at me like I was an idiot. I said, Catherine, did I say something wrong? She said, Steve, why do you think we hired you? And then I realized that she had actually been selecting CEOs for this pattern. Next idea is about culture is that I tried lots of management techniques, collaborative, touchy-feely, etc. I've just kind of observed, both for me and if you watch Bill Gates, Facebook, Google, Amazon, at best they're a benign dictatorship. I'm happy to listen to everybody's opinion, but at the end of the day, we're not going to vote about the features. At the end of the day, you have to make decisions. And at the end of the day, we're not going to lay off or fire the collaborative team. It's going to be the CEO. That's going to be the ex-CEO. And I just had to keep remembering that, thanks, I've listened to everybody, I've considered your opinion, but at the end, at least for me, and for the patterns I've seen, you need to make sure that you know where the buck stops. And that gets me into a decision-making process that I kind of called good enough decision-making. And I've seen this happen from CEOs who come from large companies. And that is, let's get all the facts. Well, by the time we get all the facts, you could be working at IBM. That's not what we have in a startup. We have a finite amount of time, and every minute and hour is burning a ton of cash and opportunities. And I kind of just put decisions into two categories. Revocable decisions, that is, decisions that with relatively minimum effort we could change, whether it was a feature or a customer to go after, et cetera, or irrevocable decisions. I just signed a lease for 5 years in a building. Or I just fired, a third of my staff. Those are relatively irrevocable. Or I just signed a most favored nations clause with a potential customer. Revocable decisions you could change. Irrevocable decisions, it's a lot harder to back out of. And so I've come up with a pretty simple heuristic when I was a CEO. And it was revocable decisions need to be made in one meeting. Thank you very much. We're making did I hear everybody's feedback and input? Thank you very much. We've just made a decision. And by the time you make 10 of these, a large company is probably scheduling the conference room for them to have a meeting. And if you just keep this up, you end up operating at speed and tempo that looks like a blur to your competitors. Speed, tempo, revocable versus irrevocable decisions. It was just part of a culture that I found actually was effective, and you could teach to the people below you. You could have your VPs and your execs just filtering, is this a revocable or irrevocable decision? Are we going to make the decision now, or are we going to have 3 committees for 4 weeks and end up making essentially 90% as good of a decision? And so what I was looking for was to have momentum going on in forward motion. Now, I can't give a presentation without talking about the lean startup, so I will insert this in the middle. But these are more of things I've learned rather than giving you a pitch about the 4 steps of the epiphany or the startup owner's manual or lean. You're probably sick of it. But I'm going to tell you how some of these were derived. And this was painfully derived. First one was funding is not validation of your business model. Boy, I got this one wrong a lot. It's customers. That's validation. But I have to tell you, I remember at Vinod's last company getting a round with John Doerr giving you the Pope's blessing. I was done, right? I mean, the world just said I had been validated. Kleiner Perkins, and now today the equivalent is Coastal, has invested in your company. All I needed to do was change that last slide, which asked for $12 million, to ask for an order. And that's all I needed to do was take that same deck out and now show it to customers. And therefore, all I need to do is execute the plan. As CEOs, don't fall into the trap of thinking fundraising is the goal. It's really easy to go, I'm going from one round to another, and that's what I'm supposed to be doing. That's a tactic. That's not the goal. The goal is to have a lot of those customers paying your bills, not the next round of funding. And most of you are probably most smarter than I am, but this one, it just cost me a couple of companies, thinking that the goal was to raise the next round of money. And finally, probably the biggest insight that I had in my whole career was this one, which is startups are not smaller versions of large companies. Nowadays, that's pretty well understood, but When I was an entrepreneur, the way you did a startup was the way you did a large company. Large companies wrote business plans, startup wrote business plans. Large companies hired VPs of sales and marketing and biz dev, we'll do the same. Large companies wrote a 5-year plan, we'll do that. Large companies execute, we'll execute. When in fact, we now know that most of you, there are some corner cases, but most of you are not smaller versions of large companies at all. What most of you are doing now are actually searching for a repeatable and scalable business model. And in fact, that's the corollary to startups are not a smaller version. For 20 years, if someone would have asked me, Steve, what's a startup? I would have said, it's a great place to bring your dog, get free food at night. It's a tight band of, men and women working together on a common. But there was no real definition. And in fact, when I started teaching, I realized every professor was defining it differently. So I came up with a definition that's as follows. A startup is a temporary organization designed to search for a repeatable and scalable business model. Now, almost all of you know this, but for me, the real first bullet was, the goal of a startup is not to become a startup. The goal of a startup is to become a large company. Well, how do we do that? Well, we're searching for something. And again, if you're engineers, you think, the goal is to write some code or build more hardware. If you're in sales, it's to get some orders. And actually, my insight was, no, it's not. It's the sum of all of these things. And they're embodied in a business model, which says, who are your customers? What's the product market fit? What's the channel? What's the right acquisition model? What's revenue strategy? What's cost, et cetera? You're searching for all those components. Obviously, the first two you're searching for is the intersection between value proposition, your product and service, and the customer segments. But basically, what you're doing is search. What you do in an existing company is execution. And that really, really messed me up for years. Because I believed once I wrote the plan, we were done. And what I now know is that great founders search, and then they execute. And one of the side effects of this was learning that the place of a great CEO is not behind your desk managing or coding 24/7. What I found is that there are no facts inside your building, so get the hell outside. And this came to me in a meeting almost 2 decades ago. I don't know, any of you have system planning meetings or the equivalent of, product strategy meetings in your company? Anybody do that anymore? Yeah, some of you. I remember, we were about a month into the startup arguing about what features, what order, whatever. And then I realized we were all just talking to see who was the smartest person in the room. And I finally said, hey, we all just got our business cards. Can you all leave the room and grab a business card? People looked at me like I was crazy. I said, no, let's all go get our business cards. Got back in the room. I said, everybody put your business card in front of you. Okay. I said, mine says CEO. Anybody have a better card? What? I said, anybody have a better card? Well, no. I said, guess what? As long as we're arguing about whose opinion, mine wins. The meeting's over. Now, the first person to come in with a fact or tell me you've been a domain expert that has some data, then we could have an interesting discussion. But right now, we're just arguing about who's the best in winning arguments or who says they're the smartest person in the room. It isn't moving our agenda forward. Because, in fact, what we'll find out later is that we're not smarter than the collective intelligence of our potential customers. It's a huge idea. We're not smarter than the potential intelligence of our collective customers. The other corollary to this is when you get outside the building and you're the CEO, you could do something that no proxy for you can do. A VP of sales can't do this, your VP of engineering can't do this, and what it is when a customer says no, you could ask the question, so what would you buy? Or what is the most important thing you're working on? And if you hear, oh yeah, too bad you're not doing X, we'd buy 10,000 of those, what do you think you could do? You could say, funny you bring that up. That's our next product. Now, it doesn't mean you need to have attention deficit disorder and change your company back and forth, but it might be the market is trying to talk to you. And only as the CEO can you make that decision that this is not some data I need to ignore, that this is some data I need to engage with and figure out whether the market is trying to tell you that your business model needs to change. You will never find that behind a desk. More importantly, you will never find that from a VP of sales. And in fact, the model for VP of sales is you found the company, you might hire your first VP of sales, you go out and sell it. VP of sales goes out, it's not selling, comes back to you, the CEO, and what's the first thing you tell the VP of sales when they say your product's not selling? You bet. Did we make this up before? No. You're selling it wrong. Can't be anything wrong because I'm the founder. It was my idea. Right? So you send them out again. And this time she comes back after another couple of weeks or a month and says, Steve, it's still not selling. Now what do? You bet. You fire the VP of sales, then you fire the VP of marketing because, sales said it was the marketing department's problem. Now just imagine the exercise where your board doesn't allow you as the CEO for the first 6 months until you find a repeatable model to hire any proxy, that you have to go out and have these conversations. And the first time you go to a potential customer and they say it's not what I want, you say, what an idiot. And the second time, another idiot. But about the third to fifth time, and for me it usually took about 12, cognitive dissonance starts setting in and smoke starts coming out of your ears because you personally have to deal with this. You can't fire anybody. Just want you to think about what getting out of the building means. So I mentioned this, you're not smarter than the collective intelligence of your customers. A minimum viable product, that is the minimum feature set, is probably the best way on earth to preserve cash. I think here, Blue River Technology, and are they there? Here? Again, Eric Reese and Blue River happen to be my best students ever, and thank you, Vinod, for funding them. I think this is a classic example of being in the robotics business and spending $1.5 million to get your first customer has to be a record of least amount of cash spent. A pivot, which I define as a substantive change to one or more of the business model components, basically fires the plan before we fire the founder. This might seem trite, but it's actually pretty profound. Some of you mentioned this before when we didn't make our sales numbers in the past. We'd have the canonical board meeting and the VP of sales, when asked how the numbers would go, great pipeline. Right? Some of you are laughing, others of you will encounter this later. But basically, that would continue until you fired the VP of sales, then you fired the VP of marketing, then you fired the founder. Not once in that old way we did stuff did we ever question that maybe the problem wasn't the executive, maybe the problem was the initial assumptions about the business model. That maybe we should just, in fact, be changing or pivoting who our customer segments were, what our product features were, etc. A pivot now says that a startup actually goes from failure to failure, and that what we're doing outside the building is learning and discovering. Now, the good news is, since actually it was Eric Reese who coined the phrase of this little arrow I used to have, called it the pivot, it's actually been an excuse for attention deficit disorder in some class of founders. So a pivot is also not an excuse for I just heard from the latest customer and changed my mind. So I kind of have a 72-hour rule on a pivot, is you're not allowed to run into your company and declare a new strategy until, in fact, you processed it and actually tried it out on someone other than your management team for 72 hours, or else you end up whiplashing an exec staff. Execution. This is what I lived through. Only VCs in Soviet Union believed that a 5-year plan could be built on a series of unknowns. In the old days, I don't know what we do now. Appendix A, your income statement, balance sheet, and cash flow were what you delivered to your VCs, and they did due diligence and funded it. The problem is if you're in a new market, that you have some real big ideas that, the reality is you're just guessing. But we funded those anyway because that was what they wanted to see. Why? Because big companies with existing revenue did income statement, balance sheet, and cash flow, and no one else had any metrics. So without any metrics, that's what we used. It turns out that market type actually determines whether you could write one of these or not. I won't go into the details, but we kind of would now understand that if you're entering an existing market, what's the definition of an existing market? It exists. You can name it. There are customers, there are competitors, there's no pricing, etc. You could probably do a forecast. But if you're in a different market, a new market, one that doesn't exist at all, that you got funded because of your vision, trying to do a forecast is like the divide by zero problem, and you just kind of like, well, 100 million in 5 years. In fact, I always used to tell my students that there's a secret Excel key code to auto-generate that business model, and they're still looking for it, actually. In fact, I thought I'd make one up just to like spook them and tell them that they were just been hitting the wrong keys. But you need to ask yourself, wait a minute, am I in an existing market or am I in a new market? And there are variants on this because it affects how much cash you burn. Why? Because it affects customer adoption. In an existing market, you're just taking share. In a new market, this is the classic hockey stick, and most of you are going to end up on the flat part of the stick for a long time. So understanding your cash needs, your staffing needs, etc., really depends on understanding what type of market you're in. Now, this was the other thing in putting together execution plans. Market research firms are excellent at predicting the past. And in fact, if they were great at predicting the future, they'd be hedge funds. And so, when everybody says, well, what does, name of favorite Gartner, et cetera, say, take these with a grain of salt because you're the ones who are inventing the future. And this was my observation, no business plan survives first contact with customers. You write it, you got funded, no one read it, they looked at your PowerPoint was a summary of a plan. It's great to put your thoughts together, but the irony is we were making a lot of wasted motion in doing this because the plan historically was a static document. The other corollary to this is we report the wrong things at board meetings. Again, I don't know what your board meetings are like, but mine used to be, when I first became a CEO, learn about income statement, balance sheet, cash flow, learn what font they wanted to see it in. And okay, my first board meeting, I pushed it across the table. Income statement said 0. But it was great. It was formatted correctly. And I did this for 18 months, pushed it across the table. And we talk about that forecast. But no one was talking about, what am I finding out about sales cycle? What's the feedback from customers? What's my potential acquisition cost? What am I learning rather than what's the plan? And so at least when I used to sit through board meetings after I retired, I'd be asking them for a whole different set of numbers because if your income statement is saying 0, there's a whole set of metrics that matter that you're discovering, and that's what we ought to be talking about in board meetings. And if you're not, you're having the wrong type of board meeting with the wrong type of board. Eventually, you'll be lucky enough to be talking about income statement. But for me, out of that pile of paper, there were only 2 numbers that mattered. Is what's your burn rate and how much cash do you have in the bank? And then what are you learning about the rest of your metrics to get you to a revenue plan? So for me, relentless part of execution was to focus on rapid and iterative learning. Because while I always thought I was a visionary, in the back of my head, I kind of knew that 90% of the time, most startup CEOs are actually hallucinating. Right? We all don't succeed. And so what I wanted to do is be turning that faith-based enterprise, which was my startup, into fact-based as quickly as I can. And then, and only then, I was the biggest son of a bitch for execution you've ever seen. But I understood the difference between executing on someone else's plan versus searching for the data that was actually meaningful. And the other thing I learned about execution is that no from a customer was just the beginning of a conversation. And that was just kind of the New Yorker in me, but most of you as CEOs kind of have that embedded in you anyway, is that a no just means, well, what would you get to give me a yes? Probably the most interesting thing I've learned now as a public official in California is that disruption scares most real people. We're, as CEOs and founders and entrepreneurs, disruption is part of our life. But the mainstream of this country, let alone any other country, it's scary. They don't want to be disrupted. They're actually quite happy, except in special cases, doing what they've been doing. And more importantly, for all of you in regulated markets, if you don't have a lobbyist or you don't understand who the lobbyists are in regulated markets for the incumbents, you're going to be roadkill. It doesn't mean in all markets, because in a good number of them, the incumbents are kind of just sitting on the side. But in a couple of others, they will defend their turf with tools you just don't even know exist. And I would start with lobbyists. Last thing is only 2 reasons for press. And by press, I mean blogs and TechCrunch and all this other stuff. At least for me, one is creating end-user demand and driving it into my channel. That's the only reason I really want to think about press. And the other is as part of a fundraising strategy. Everything else is just ego and hubris. Can I do 30 more seconds? Is that all right? Let me just talk about career. Some of the things I learned is you have one company. And if you have normal 2 VCs on your board, you'll see them every 6 weeks or so. What you don't realize is when they're pulling up into your parking lot, before you get revenue, they have to look up your name. They don't even remember what your company is, because they're sitting on 10 to 12 boards. You're seeing one of them, they're seeing 10 to 12 of you. And so while you have one company, they have a portfolio. And that's good and bad. The good news is they do a terrible job of telling you why they're smarter than you. I think for the last 40 years, VCs have, including Vinod, with all due respect, have undersold their value. Even if they were deaf, dumb, and blind, in a great career, a VC is sitting through 400 to 500 patterns that look like you. And when they give you advice, the question you should ask them is, am I hearing this from you because you didn't have coffee, or you've seen this model before and you understand how it's going to play out? And I think that's the most undervalued part of getting great advice from great VCs. And you've all here because you've gotten an investment from one. And you ought to take advantage of what that pattern recognition looks like. The other thing is founders get fired for a couple of reasons, for not understanding 2 things. One is your VC's business model. Your VC's business model is different than your business model. And unless you understand how they make money and when they want to sell and what their goals are, you might get unaligned. And the other one is that you don't understand what your skills are for the phase of the company. You might be the world's best CEO for searching for a business model, but the day you walk into the board meeting and say, we found a repeatable model, you might be surprised that the VCs are looking at each other, all thinking that magic word, operating exec. And unless you understand what skills they think they need at different phases of the company to go satisfy their business model, which is liquidity, you're going to have potentially a surprise. So I just want to close with, for me, one of the biggest insights was thinking for decades that my journey was a singular one. That is, that no one else was doing or going through what I go through. The fact that we have these meetings and conferences, the fact that there's now a bunch of literature out there, I hope you now understand that you're not alone, that this is a common path, and that this is probably the best adventure you could ever been on. So I want to thank you very much, and have a great time. Take care. Thanks.
Steve, we'll take one question.
What's the best question? Come on. Any question.
Okay.
All right.
Well,
Going one. Oh, there's one.
Got a question. You said you're not as smart as your customers' collective wisdom, something like that. That might be true some places, but I think when you're trying to bring something new to some customers,
Right.
they're not the guy to ask. They already know it doesn't work.
So this goes back to the market type question, and then I usually get this with, well, Steve Jobs never asked customers, blah, 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 blah. And the answer is, you need to ask yourself if you're in an existing market or a new one. If you're in an existing market, going outside and doing customer discovery and asking people what's the basis of competition, why would you buy, et cetera, that makes all the sense in the world. That's the collective intelligence thing. When you're creating something new, asking those same questions, again, is a divide by zero answer, just like you said. But sitting in your building is also the wrong answer, because I will contend what you need to understand is what their day in the life looks like today and what you believe the day in the life is going to look like in the future. And therefore, you do get out, but you ask very different things. And I don't know if that makes sense, but thank you very much.